Hey everyone, and welcome back to Volunteer Friendly, episode 15, Should We Pay Our Volunteers? Volunteer Friendly is a show for anyone involved in making Sunday happen, primarily worship leaders, tech directors, production folks. And the goal of Volunteer Friendly each week is to present you with a question, a topic, a statement that hopefully makes you contemplate on your own and then discuss with your team. It's a podcast that should irritate you. It's not a podcast that you should listen to and agree with, or at least not every episode. In today's episode, I want to ask the question, should we pay our volunteers? Now, that may be a bit of a silly thing because you're thinking, well, doesn't the definition of volunteer literally mean like not paid? But I want to use volunteer kind of in the context that we often mean for church. I've worked at churches before where, and obviously pretty much every church has staff members, paid staff members. Maybe you have full-time, maybe you have part-time. And then you have volunteers that help serve and make Sunday happen. But then it's very likely and very possible that you have volunteers that are really core, really key to making Sunday happen. And in fact, if they weren't there, Sunday could not happen. Sometimes that's the worship team. Sometimes that's production folks. Maybe that's it's audio engineer. At the church I work at here in Austin in particular, when we have external audio engineers come in, they're volunteers. Maybe you want to call them contractors, but they're paid. They're paid volunteers. So I understand that could sound like a contradictory term. Should we pay our volunteers? But I want you to just live in that moment just for a second. I've been in conversations with folks though that see this very much as a black and white situation. They believe there's no gray, that if you are serving at a church and you're not on staff, you should be a volunteer. You should not be paid. Now, I do find it ironic that a lot of the folks that believe that are people that are paid by a church because they're on staff. So I'm kind of like, well, maybe you should quit your job and just be volunteer only at the church. But I digress. That's neither here nor there. And that's a whole nother conversation for another day. But I've been in conversations with people that they believe strongly, no, volunteers should not be paid. But I've been in situations, context. I'm in a current context where we pay volunteers at my church. I've been at other churches where we pay volunteers. But what's interesting in that dynamic is you don't pay all your volunteers. You don't pay your greeters. At least I've never heard of a church that pays greeters. You probably likely don't pay the people that watch the kids in kids ministry, but a lot of churches pay their worship team volunteers. A lot of churches pay their production, audio engineers or production volunteers. And so if you're listening to this and you have an immediate strong opinion, I want you to have a little empathy. I want you to understand the context, the culture of church, the context that people do different, that do church is different. Your scenario, you pay people, you can never imagine not paying people. Well, imagine for a second, maybe even close your eyes if you have to, not if you're driving and listening to this podcast, but imagine there could be a scenario where people don't pay their volunteers. That sounds scary to you. Or if you're someone that maybe you're at a smaller church, maybe you even volunteer, you're not on staff as a worship leader and you just go, I can't imagine paying someone to volunteer here. Just imagine that there are churches, there's scenarios that are so big and require so many people, and certain things are of so much importance that they have to guarantee that someone's there, that they end up paying volunteers. In fact, I know churches that have gone from models where they paid volunteers, let's say for a worship band. This is the scenario I'm thinking of, the church I'm particularly thinking of. They paid the musicians that played in the band. They paid singers that played in the band. But they decided, because of some budget reasons, to cut that. And what's interesting is you look at the band and the makeup of the band, and a lot of the people that were paid, that were there every Sunday, that were faithful volunteers, are no longer there. They switched from being paid to not being paid, and for many different reasons, and I don't want to place judgment, they no longer work there. They no longer serve there and get paid. So I've seen a lot of different scenarios there. Again, I want you to try to widen your kind of horizon here and think that there's different scenarios. One, I want you to imagine, if you're not there, that again, there's a church that's so big enough that does so many things that it's really crucial that volunteers get paid, that it goes off without a hitch. Everything works really, really well. And then I want you to imagine there's churches that are so small that have zero budget. They can't even pay their pastor, their worship leader, that everyone's volunteer, right? That's just very much a gray area. I've yet to find, fourth epistles that Paul says, thou shalt pay their volunteers, right? I've been looking for it, but I haven't found it quite yet. But you've got to think, there's some contexts where it's almost like necessitates paying people to make sure they're consistently there. But with that, there are some negative side effects of getting paid. Again, I mentioned that church that I know very well that went from paying people that are on the worship team. And then when they took that away, almost all of those people no longer serve there anymore. There's some negative effects of that. I don't want to share all of them because this is, again, not a podcast for me of like share my personal opinion, but you can see how paying people to be there, you may not get the right people. You may get people that are there for the wrong reasons. There's some things that could be corruptible in that process. And so we'll talk about those in just a moment. One of the things we do on Volunteer Friendly each week, again, every episode's less than 10 minutes. That's the goal. That's what I shoot for, is I want to provide you content. Again, a question that provokes, that really makes you think, but I want to provide you content that forces you to contemplate on your own and then to discuss with your team. So a way to make this really easy, we put together a downloadable PDF every week. You give enough space for you to write, to leave answers. And the goal is I would love for you to download that and for you to spend some time before rehearsal, before you present this to your team, to work through this and then present it to your team to discuss, to get their feedback. Now, this one may be a subject you discuss more on your staff team and less with your volunteers, but I think in particular, the third question we'll get to will really be good to bring up with your team. If you are paying volunteers, it's a good discussion to have to get ahead of. To get those questions, that free downloadable PDF, click the link in the description of this video. You can head to volunteerfriendly.com. Also look for episode 15 and you can download this PDF. So let's get to those questions. Number one, and I want you to think about your particular scenario and apply this. Number one, in our culture and ministry context, should we pay volunteers? Again, you may not currently, but I want you to think about it. Maybe you should, or maybe you're currently paying volunteers and you go, man, now that I think about this, now that I see the end result of what's happened, now that I've seen how this has corrupted this, maybe we shouldn't pay volunteers. I want you to think, contextualize it to your scenario. In our culture and ministry context, should we pay our volunteers? Number two, this is going to be an interesting one. Bear with me for a second. Potentially thought-provoking. But number two, what volunteers should be paid and what volunteers shouldn't be paid? What volunteers should be paid and what volunteers shouldn't be paid? That's an interesting concept. I presented it before because the churches that I know that pay their worship team, I've seen some churches where they pay the band, but not vocalists. I've seen some scenarios where the band volunteers, but the vocalists are paid. I've seen some scenarios where the band and vocals are paid. That's the typical one I see. But again, the greeter is not paid. The kids ministry volunteers are not paid. So think about your context, what volunteers should be paid and what volunteers shouldn't be paid. There's a lot of gray in that. I hate to tell you, it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray in that. And then number three, and finally, this is going to be one that's super important. And I think you should discuss with your volunteers, particularly if you're paying or you're about to start paying. But number three, what is a negative result of paying our volunteers we should look out for? What is a negative result of paying our volunteers we should look out for? I'll give you one as an example. They start to become entitled. They start to feel like this is a job, things like that. And then here's what I want you to do to take that knowledge, to take those discussions, is think, what steps can we do to hold each other accountable so we don't get to that place? And have that discussion with the volunteers that you either pay or you're about to pay, particularly before you make that switch. Have that discussion so that before you make that transition, and those that stick around and make that transition with you, you're all on the same page and you all work together to make sure that doesn't happen. So again, to get those questions, click the link in the description of this video in the show notes if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or head to volunteerfriendly.com if you're driving and look for episode 15. Would love to see you back next week as we continue the goal of, again, kind of poking the bear, providing content that really makes you contemplate and then discuss with your team. And I hope this is a valuable resource to you. If it is, do me a favor, share this with one person. Find one person, one worship leader, production person, tech person that you think would enjoy this. Send them a text, tell them, check out Volunteer Friendly. And I will see you next week, 10 a.m. Central, next Thursday, for our next episode of Volunteer Friendly. Take care, everybody. Bye.